Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another CSGO map analysis video. Today I'm looking at Iris by BubkeZ and Oliver. If you're interested, there is an interview with Oliver who did the environment art. There is an interview with him on this channel, so check that out. I'll have a link in the description. But these are two very experienced individuals. Obviously BubkeZ himself needs no introduction, and of course Oliver has just been responsible for a lot of art down a lot of years. So we're going to take a look at this map. This is a map that has been out for some time now, probably made a bit more waves before when people realized like the sort of lineage of the creators. And certainly a map that I've played a lot, I've streamed a lot of when I do those game night streams that I talked about in the previous map analysis video. So yeah, we're definitely going to be taking a look. We're going to be checking out the map itself, but it's a bit of an older one. It's not something that's really been updated anytime recently in a significant manner, and there's certainly not really any plans to revisit it in the near future. So this is certainly a more sort of like tried and true solid map that at this point we can expect is in its final form, which is not always the case for the other maps that I have done reviews of or analyses of. So first things first, I got a comment in the previous video where I realized through this comment that I should probably just show you guys the layout and sort of lay out the case for the map that it makes itself, essentially showing you guys the objective, the elements of the map that just cannot be denied or disputed, instead of immediately jumping into some sort of like tirade or tangent that I often do. We can save that for after you guys know the layout. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to walk over to A from T spawn. Notably, the rotation into mid and B is a bit of a hill. It's very roomy, very nice. Plenty of room to maneuver. There's even this little bit, if you wanted to get super fancy, you could like jump through this. So that's pretty cool. Got a soccer ball here. My brother likes that. And here we have one of the, it's not really a contact point, but it's certainly an area where there's going to be a lot of interesting intersections, because we've got this upper area which can be boosted into, must be respected. The T's can boost somebody in there. I imagine that would be a rather default play in general, just to have somebody, even if he's only on the balcony, and you know he gets onto the balcony and then jumps over here, because he's got a nice little line of sight over there. So that's something to keep in mind. Obviously, there's the rotation into middle from the A long or A outer area, whatever you would call this. The A approach is a nice little on-ramp as well, a bit of a play in elevation. And then we get to the A bomb site. Obviously, there's a bunch of different angles that you can take as a CT. You can come out here from this side to look down that area. You can hold from the truck, on top of the truck, or behind it, which is a more passive angle, of course. And something to keep in mind is that there is this like tiny little crack that you can use. So that's essentially where we go from there. CT spawn is up that staircase in the distance that I'll show off in a second, but this is the A bomb site. As you can see, you're limited into where you can actually plant the bomb by these lovely little spray paint can things. Cans of spray paint were used, many of them, in fact. And of course, this is what leads out into the balcony from before. Open this door. You've got to make noise in order to enter the site from this angle, but it's certainly something that it's a subtle enough sound cue that I think at first it could be mistaken. Like, it's not like the nuke doors, which is very, very noisy, right? So that's something to keep in mind as well. Then we're just going to go to CT spawn, and we'll just circle back into mid after the fact. Here's CT spawn. You can see some of the spawns right here, and obviously they've done a great parking job. There's a rotation into mid from CT spawn that involves you jumping down a vent. I'll show you that in a second. But first, let's go to B. B has two different areas that you can approach. B heaven is certainly pretty long, like pretty high up. A lot of verticality in this particular area. And as you can see over there, there is a spot that's sort of an equivalent for T's to go into. So you could imagine there being some sort of op duels or just even rifle duels throughout that. Aside from that, there's obviously also the lower approach, which is what this looks like here. A lot of noise has to be made, and the map is laid out in such a way that you have to make, take a little bit of time to actually rotate down here. And so I would imagine that maybe you would want to actually commit to the site if you were going to go on the lower side and then maybe have somebody heaven. And either way, like the heaven guy could just jump out if he needs to rotate, and the site guy could play around a couple of different angles. There's obviously this rotation from the A bomb site to the B bomb site, almost like a secondary CT area, if you will. You can't really call it a middle, but this is what that approach looks like if you're going from the A bomb site that we were just at to this B bomb site here. So a lot of different angles to consider there. We'll show off the T side of things. So obviously the T side of things also has multiple layers. It has an upper and a lower. So if we go all the way back to the T spawn, we go up this ramp. This would take us to mid if we wanted it to. but there's a couple of options here. So one of the things that I always like to do is do some jumps over here, and this will take you to that heaven area. You can aim duel with the guys over there. You can also, if you decide to just take the more pedestrian route, you can go this lower area, and suddenly here you are, looking directly at where the CTs come out. So you can see there's a lot of parity with the angles, at the very least in this particular case. You know, there's certainly a lot of like it's very, very consistent in that where you come out as a T, you will essentially be already looking towards the right area for the to match the other team's approach, essentially. So I think it's a nice little touch. Let's show off mid now. We'll go from T-spawn to mid. So obviously, just like the bomb sites having an upper and a lower sort of approach that you can take, I mean, the same thing is true for mid. In many ways, it's rather consistent. So this is the T side equivalent of the vent drop that I was talking about earlier. So you go up these stairs, you can bust this window. Obviously, you're going to want to do that in order to deal the full amount of damage to any enemies. And then you're sort of going to be, I would imagine you'd be like jiggling over here. And you also have to keep in mind that it's very easy to make this jump by design for the CTs. I'm not sure that you'd ever be in range to hear the vent break. Pretty sure there does need to be a vent break, so this is what it looks like for the CTs. Maybe, depending on spawns, you might be able to hear a vent break. It's also not like the Mirage one, similar to how the door is not as noisy as the nuke one. That vent is not as noisy as the Mirage one, so it might even be something that gets like obfuscated by other sounds. This is the lower mid area. Notably, I think you would actually need... I'm not even sure if it's possible to boost up on this one. I don't remember my hotkeys. There we go. So yeah, okay, you can boost up through here, which would give you a very powerful flank, but that would involve two people making that jump, which is obviously something to keep in mind. I've actually never done that one before, so that's a first. And yeah, so that's pretty much the layout, right? Obviously, there's this little room here, which is the mid to A connector, obviously more so on the T side than it is on the CT side, and this is the B, or mid to B connector, which is more on the CT side, more closer to the bomb site, right? If we had to like break it down by that, the connector to B takes you much more directly towards the bomb site, whereas the connector to A, at least a little bit more on the T side, just takes you to that staging area. And this is the mid path from CT spawn, basically. So you would come out from CT spawn down these stairs and make your approach over here. Okay, so I think now we've gone over the layout. Definitely took me a little bit longer than expected. There's a lot of pathways to consider for this particular map. So now we're going to go over it once more with feeling, once more with a little bit more in-depth, actually breaking down what I think about some of these things. So like I said earlier, there's plenty of space for you to walk around in this particular area. I really like that because I feel like a lot of the maps that I've reviewed have had funnel points that make it really, really difficult to navigate, and this map is, really, really nice at, really, really good at keeping you at a relatively open position. So that is something that I'm a pretty big fan of. So obviously, points for that. There are still some natural areas where there's going to be some choke points. There's some pretty useful positions from the CT perspective, like the little micro angle I was talking about earlier over here, where you can actually see a little bit over there, and this is like an off angle in a way. Obviously, you could jump up a little bit more. I think you can barely see them cross. This would probably be better as like a pixel gap for an op or something. So if we were to bring out the op, the big green, and again, this is without jumping and everything, right? So like that gives you a shot of the car over there, so that's obviously a very powerful angle, and you definitely need to smoke or flash that off. The smoke grenade that I showed off earlier is a pretty easy one. This is a 60... this is a 128 tick server, but I'm pretty sure that works on 64 tick as well. Not that it really matters. Obviously, this is a situation where you have to, you have to figure out what you actually want to smoke. So that while that smoke is pretty useful, because, well, we'll just rethrow it. As you can see, it bounces there. And then off the car, gives you a nice little angle onto the site. Basically completely isolates anybody who's like, playing from over here, trying to look down at you. And down the stretch, right? So obviously it's not going to be super useful anyway, because like I was just saying, you have to isolate the truck. You've got to isolate maybe here. You obviously have to just like pray that they're not holding this angle. There's a lot of different angles that CTs can take for this particular area. And one of the things that I really like is that this is one of the few maps that doesn't feel like demonstrably T or CT sided, at least on its face, because of the opportunities that a lot of that both teams have utility-wise. But one of the things that you have to keep that in mind is, like, obviously an open skybox and like a lot of opportunities for boosting and utility to get positional advantages. That's something that generally does favor Ts, because it makes bomb sites in theory easier to access, but it's attenuated in this map by having a lot of options for the CTs to position and then fall back to if they so desire. And that to me is something that's really cool, because basically it allows you to say as a CT that you want to take like a forward position and force out like maybe some T utility to clear positions. Like even if you only take it a couple rounds, they might have to start like working that into their playbook because they don't want to get caught off. So even if you as an opper end up over here a lot, and you know maybe you do this the first couple gun rounds or something, and you pick somebody off or you lurk behind this position or something, that can really throw a team off guard, and that can get them to the point where they are very much worried about such a situation. And so that's a situation where I think it makes sense to, at that point, start to, as a T side, you know, smoke that off or flash that off or whatever the case may be. When you're in a situation like that, it allows you to then fall back and then maybe not take that position every time. Maybe take this position that we talked about before on the truck. Maybe take an even further back passive position where you play on top of this area and you look over here. And this, in this situation, they've got to like start throwing more smokes and all of this other stuff. There's only so many grenades and utility lineups and team allocations that they can do to clear you out. And that's where I think it really favors teams who are able to not only adapt to what their opposition is doing, but just like be able to change up their own style to some degree to give them a little bit of an edge. And it's a map like this that really I think I would just love to see this in competitive, honestly. Like I would love to see this being played, you know, instead of some of the maps that people are tired of, like Mirage and Dust 2, I've heard a lot of comments on. And, you know, even as just like an isolation map, like even if you didn't take any other map out, right? If you just talked about the potential for another map to be in the pool, this is a map that would be pretty high up there. It's like this, you know, in my mind, it's like Basalt and Feast and a couple others. This one is pretty much top dog, top ticket. Would really like to see this one in competitive. And I think it's just because the CTs don't feel like they don't have decisions to make, that they're like constrained at pretty much any position. If something happens because the Ts clear them out with utility, they can adapt because of the different angles and the different contact points and the different choke points and just the different options that are given to them. They can counter utility, they can, you know, counter position, right? They can potentially like make that noise in the door just to threaten. Like imagine you're a T and you've been boosting over here and you know they have had this door shut for a lot. You just like get in a position and you hear the door open. Maybe you don't hear the door close. Maybe the guy's not even over there. Maybe he's not even looking over there. But now you've all of a sudden got to use that utility. Like these are just small things based on sound cues and based on angles and positions that I think are really, really useful for CTs to change up the game if they are being, you know, dominated by the Ts in some capacity. They can find some way to change up their style and respond to that. At the same time, there's ways to double down with the same sort of style that's already working, because you can just throw a couple of wrinkles in, like a couple of different utility pieces, and you know it'll work out just fine. And that's a situation where I think it just makes sense to use this sort of map in that way. You have to actually do a bit of a run in order to get that the way that I like it. But yeah, there's all sorts of different situations where I think both teams essentially have that ability, because like I was saying earlier, the Ts have the opportunity to just change it up and play more tactically, whereas the CTs have a bit of that, but also have a lot of reflexes. And that's an interesting thing, because like I was talking about in Marine, right, in the breakdown of Marine, if you have a situation where like one bomb site is generally more about reactions and mechanics, then you're in a situation where I think it's really easy to say that, like, oh, this favors a certain kind of player. But when a side has a bit of a preference there, right? And it's not, again, it's not binary. It's not like the Ts must be tactical and the CTs must be high skill in a mechanical sense. But when it feels like there's opportunities for different kinds of players to find disproportionate success on different sides, I do think that's kind of interesting. Because maybe the mechanical player can be, you know, like attenuated on CT side by really good tactical play, and maybe the tactical player, you know, can get shut down by mechanical play. So there's a lot of interplay there, I guess, is the bottom line. Anyway, a bomb site overall, I think that there's a lot to like about it. Obviously, if you end up doing a late take or something, that smoke grenade that I threw earlier might actually be useful, because It cuts off any eyes on the rotations, and if you're able to take site control just with a couple of smokes, something like that, and the one that I threw earlier, you've essentially allowed yourself to plant right here, and then you can sort of fall back. It's just that you don't have a whole lot of site control. That's another aspect of this map that I think is underrated about it, if you can even call it underrated, I guess. But one of the things that I think you don't see a lot in other maps is the idea of separating out an individual bomb site into, like, essentially sections of influence, where if you think about, like, Mirage and Dust 2 A-bomb site, for example, but Mirage A-bomb site as well, there's situations where you own part of the bomb site as Ts, but you have not taken control of other parts of the bomb sites, right? And that level of complexity in the middle of just looking at one bomb site, very uncommon. And it's also very uncommon to see that actualized in the middle of gameplay. I'll give you an example. So basically, like, in a situation where, you know, in a lot of other maps, I think you would, when you take part of the bomb site, you've essentially taken all of the bomb site. Like Dust 2 B site is a great example of this. And it's not to say that that's an inferior design philosophy or an inferior aspect, or in some ways it's a worse bomb site, because obviously that just means it's harder to retake, but it's also harder to take in the first place, right? It requires a bit of a different kind of investment and a bit of a different kind of strategy. But when it comes to isolating this bomb site with a couple of smokes and planting the bomb, it's almost like you're taking it as if it's like you know, outside on Nuke, where you've got to throw all those smokes just to get into position. Honestly, B-bomb site on Nuke is a great example of exactly this, where you can have, like, control of just the bottom half that faces ramp instead of the half that faces the, you know, squeaky and stuff like that. So there's a lot of situations there, I think, where you can kind of draw parallels. And in a situation like this, where you can isolate part of the bomb site just to get a safe plant off, a lot of the times you don't see that in other maps, and that's one of those things where I feel like it adds just that other extra level, because not everything that I talk about in these videos is going to be seen in every single one of the games that you play. Not every time are you going to isolate part of the bomb site. Certainly not every round, sometimes not even every game. But the fact that there's the potential for it means that this map can be mined and just completely, like, exploited by tactical teams, by teams that want to put in the prep, and they can show us and elevate the map itself as a canvas. They can use this map as that canvas for painting whatever picture they want to paint. And, you know, then it's the other team's response, right? It's the other team's adaptation that really elevates the game and the map itself into something much greater than maybe anybody thought possible initially. That's essentially what happens with all those other maps. And that's something that I really think this map has in spades, that has potential for those kinds of things. So if we move on to mid, because I do think that there's some really interesting things about mid, particularly with how it interacts with the other sites. A lot of the gunfights and contact points are essentially going to be, you know, somebody hanging around out here waiting for a push, if a push is going to come, or they can come out over here and take aim for any lurk out of A, or obviously the T approach over there. But generally speaking, I think the Ts are going to hit around this area, maybe even a little bit before the CTs hit around this area. Though, worth noting that I have not exhaustively tested the timings, something that I might want to do in the future. That being said, there's also the opportunity for you to jump down here, as I was showing off earlier, and then just taking an angle like this. And then, of course, if you wanted to take a rifle instead and play a little bit more aggro, you could actually just drop down. And while your opper is watching this area, you could be playing around here, or even, like, around maybe just this, and, like, sort of, like, stepping around here. Like, this little pillar is definitely something that, while its lighting might be a little foobar, there's something about the placement of it that really does allow you to adds just a little bit of complexity, because now you can sort of play around this. And in a way, I think it is, like, pretty much 100% bangable. Like, it's not going to stop that much damage, so it is certainly something you still have to watch out for. But just the fact that you can do that just to sort of throw people off, I think is really cool. And obviously it's, you know, there's tons of little micro positions and off angles that you can be using here. Like, I don't know how many people are going to be expecting you to be in this position, like underneath the little barber sign, and you know, just sort of tapping away at people, or holding that with an op or something. So a lot of really interesting things there. But I really think that the one thing that sets this map apart, generally speaking, is just the sheer number of areas where there's a little bit of verticality, and areas where essentially you're choosing a different kind of pathway to migrate towards the same destination ultimately. Obviously, there's some major spanners in the works that you can throw, like boosting up in through the vent as a T, or even like stacking a couple of people in here as CT or something crazy like that. But ultimately, if you're just going to go from one of the mid rotations to either CTA, TA, or B, and you're taking the upper or lower path, at that point it really is just you're elevating and taking different angles for the gunfight, and maybe you found some lineups or something that require that kind of control, but for the most part it's just like taking a different angle on some of the mid defenders from CT that I think, just the fact that you have that decision to make in the first place, like I said earlier, there's a lot of potential for adaptations and decisions, and essentially you never feel like there's nothing else you could have done in certain situations. There's always a couple of different answers that you might be able to leverage to whatever strategy your opponent is deploying. And that is something where a lot of maps don't have that level of strategy. They don't have that level of option. They don't have those kinds of decisions that you can even make. There's also a metric fuck ton of lurk spots and obviously save spots. This is something that I don't talk about too often in these map analyses. Saving spots, I think, are really, really interesting. I'm not really sure why there's an invisible wall here, for example, because that would be a pretty nifty saving spot. But at the same time, there's a lot of opportunity for saving in just about any one of these areas. Saving spots, I think, actually are a bit more impactful than people might realize. Because obviously, you know, we've all seen a couple of highlights every now and then when somebody's getting hunted on nuke, and they're off in one of the spawns, and obviously those spots can also be used and leveraged in a different way. Like people have been opping from forklift and some really wacky stuff in the past on CT spawn of nuke, but there's because of the fact that the map is laid out the way that it is, you're actually going to see some late game rotations from either team, and sometimes they will go through the spawns, which adds another layer of importance to it. And having all of these different positions to lurk in and potentially navigate through, and again, having the option to make a decision, even if you don't actually end up doing it, like having those extra potentialities, it adds a lot of second guessing and potential. Essentially, like it gives you the opportunity to mind game the opponent in a way that not a lot of maps offer. If you're really a specialist on this map, if you really learn this map inside and out, and you figure out all the different things that you can do on this map, that's a situation where, obviously it's very map-specific mastery, but most maps don't even allow for that level, obviously. So we're not even talking about like a lot of really small micro tricks, like jumping into the window vent from the windowsill on Mirage. We're not even talking about things that are like very, very specific and mechanical based. This is just rotations, and this is just picking where you are, and maybe a little bit of teamwork for some boosts in a couple of different spots. But ultimately, it's not something that needs to like 100% always be the case in a very specific environment. There's not something where you have to worry about constantly like essentially being on point with your movement or your aim or your mechanics. In a way, it's like offering its own level of mastery and its own level of skill development. And I think that is what sets apart, you know, good maps from great maps, essentially. Is like, you'll have some good maps, and they've got some interesting decisions you can make. They've got some really, really nice layouts, and angles are considered, and cover is good, and lineups are possible, and all that stuff, right? Utilities possible, and there's aim, and there's tactics, and there's all these different things that you can leverage. But the sheer number of decisions in here that you can make, it might be a little overwhelming for some people. Obviously, there's a bit of a learning curve introduced when you do that, which is probably why a lot of other people who are maybe not as confident in their mapping skills or their abilities, maybe a lot of those mappers, those younger mappers or newer mappers, don't end up doing stuff this ambitious. And obviously, there were some versions of this map that were even more ambitious than what we see here. But that being said, there's still quite a bit that you can learn, I think. So interesting. Anyway, as I try to place my man to test something, I am curious as to if this is possible, because I'm pretty sure it is. You don't even have to stand up. Oof, maybe you do. But I'm pretty sure it's possible to boost into this window. Wait, surely yeah, okay. So yeah, you can boost into that window. That's just something that I was curious about. So yeah, ultimately, B-bomb site is also similarly interesting. Obviously, a bit more obvious verticality, a bit more apparent immediately as soon as you pop into the bomb site. Oh shit, there's this giant heaven area. I have not found any smoke lineups for that. I did find some really obscure lineup to allow you to get a safe plant off, but it was very difficult for me to remember. It was something like this. Yeah, that might actually be it. So yeah, you can do that, and then obviously you just have to worry about the man up top. But oh yeah, you'd have to walk into the smoke, I guess. But surely something to consider when you're trying to plan your tactics and strategy for this particular map. And the fact that utility like that is possible, especially for me, who's notorious for missing literally everything. Oh, that's a cute little touch with the bullseye. Didn't even notice that. Very, very nice. So yeah, ultimately the B-bomb site, I think one of the interesting things is there's a lot more aiming and action happening on the A-bomb site that's very, very close to home for the A-bomb site. Whereas on the B-bomb site, a lot of that stuff happens still pretty close to home, but like longer range battles are going on. Even when you're in the lower situation, if you're like aiming out against people over there, like if we place a man over here and then tell him to stop crouching like a goofball, we should be able to see, you know, that's about where he is, right? So we've got to be careful with that. So that's a situation where I think just in general, you want to make sure that you check your corners. You want to make sure that you're packing in the long-range weaponry, and if you're not, then you need to deploy some utility to get up close and personal. But the other wrinkle is that you can basically isolate that entire angle if you just drop over here. Now, there's probably a way to do that. I don't think there's a way to do it silently, so you'd have to make noise. But you could do something like this, and then suddenly you leverage short-range weapons if they ever end up pushing through this spawn. Another option for you as well is simply to get into that position, have somebody flash you out, and then you run out, you know, SMGs blazing, as it were. And, of course, there's like that's another level of complexity to this map that hasn't really been discussed, is like the range of certain engagements. Because I've seen like, you know, rifle and op level and, you know, range engagements, high range engagements to mid to high range, where, you know, it's stuff like this, where you're rotating out, you're trying to clear your angles, and you're like in the middle of a retake or something. I've also seen, you know, plenty of situations where even on the bomb sites themselves, you're much closer range. Like once you're into this position, the farthest thing away that's probably in play is like that door, or it's, you know, something over here maybe. That would be suicide, I feel like. It might be in this area, but if you're already over here, like there's really not that much there. So assuming the Ts have already gotten up here and the CTs are maybe along this line, it's pretty short range, you know, short to medium range. At that point, you can leverage certain shotguns, but obviously a lot of the SMGs can be leveraged for that particular purpose. And yeah, I think that makes sense. That's fair. One of the things that's like a never-ending quest for a lot of map makers is figuring out how to make certain decisions, certain buys possible at all stages, basically. And allowing you to decide, like, okay, if I'm going to have to use a shotgun or an MP9 or something like that as a CT, or obviously a MAC-10 as a T, how do I leverage that? Where do I position myself? And in some cases, it's the same position, just you've got to execute differently on this particular map, like I was just showing off at the bottom there. But there's also a situation or two where it fundamentally changes what is viable for you. Like obviously on the B-bomb site, you might have to get a little bit closer. And as a result, like what does that look like? Instead of being lower where I shot that guy in the skull, or up on heaven, you've got to somehow like maybe position yourself over here. Again, do I even have, I don't even think I do. Let's see, give weapon MAC-10. So if I'm well, I don't know why I would have a MAC-10 as a CT, but if I'm a CT and I'm holding with an SMG, you know, suddenly we're in a position where I've got to like, you know, strafe out over here, and then, you know, I'm fucked if I have to go back, so hopefully I've got a smoke or something. This would also be a super useful angle if somebody else is holding the long way, right, the halls approach, and then they're coming up the stairway into this area. At that point, this is a super useful short range. Even a rifle might even want to be positioned over here, right, because you're going to be aiming like over here for the cross, and you can get banged through this, so you got to be careful about that. But unlikely anybody's going to be in a position to bang you unless your teammate dies over there. And so you'd want to hold, spray them down over there, and then run out. I'm not really 100% sure where you would go if you had an even shorter range weapon. And I'm also not really sure where the Maginot line, where the line of scrimmage, where the CTs themselves would want to position on most rounds. Because on a lot of maps, it's like maybe 2 to mid, or 2 to each bomb site and 1 to mid. That seems to be like it's one or the other. Sometimes you'll have like 2 to a bomb site, and instead of mid, there's like a third one hanging around in like rotations. Like I talked about that being the case on overpass and stuff. So you might have like a leaner. In this particular case, I think you would probably want like one guy maybe doing this with a rifle. And maybe another guy in the mid-heaven, the little vent drop area, and he could be holding for that or for this, and sort of like setting up a crossfire there, and the guy who is in mid-heaven can just drop down and go through here when the rotation is called, because in theory, whoever's heaven on B would have a really nice line of sight advantage, and he'd probably just like throw a Molotov or a smoke over to that area to delay any approach if the Ts had been doing that. The problem that I can see too, though, is in order for CTs to rotate back towards the A-bomb site, for example, they do essentially just have to drop down here and run across, which could get them killed by a lurk, or certainly would make enough noise to be heard. It's not really that big of a deal, though, because obviously a lot of the times you're going to that's just going to be a reality. There's some really obvious ways to leverage some utility. Usually it actually falls all the way down and spreads a little bit further, but if you want to plant over there, or even like over here, I think there's probably one way to do that. Well, it's not that way. Let's try that again. Not really 100% sure. Maybe it even spreads through the wall, though. That would be pretty funny if it did. You just start Molotoving that. It might, actually. Let me see. Only visually, not damage-wise. So yeah, that's a no-go. But in theory, you can like find some lineup that does that, so you can plant here. One of the things that's really useful about this plant is if you end up taking CT control, you can actually op it or rifle it from that position. It's about there. And in such a situation that's obviously a very powerful threaten, you can also do so from the truck position as well. So that opens you up to a really, really, like that's like the ultimate luxury plant, right? Because it does open you up to those angles if you don't have complete sight control. But, otherwise, like the safe and most common plant would probably be over here because of the elimination of certain angles. Interestingly enough, I think it's possible to get wallbang. Maybe like this. Like if somebody is... Let's see. Who's my victim for this one? I think we'll have you, my ally, since I can actually see you. So that's about the position you'd be. I think I have friendly fire off, but yeah. So it is possible, like obviously they'd be crouched, right? So you'd have to do something like that. Aim a little lower probably. But if they're planning default, like that's a lineup you can do. I wonder if that means that you'd, like I'm assuming these can't be banged through. Yeah, those are completely solid. So you could probably save yourself if you position yourself just right. Like you can't plant on that little gas platform thing or whatever it is. It has to be right here. This is probably the safest plant, but I imagine that would be like sort of like some of the Mirage wall bangs that I've seen, where obviously you can just like find nade lineups for that, but that goes a little too high. But yeah, I'm sure there's something that people could do. And they would be able to throw some nades to nade you out anyway. But if you're lazy with it, or you end up going a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, like you could get banged in such a situation, especially if you're spotted doing it, but they can't like respond without, like they can't just like take an angle or whatever because of this truck. If they like sort of see you, they can just do this. So that's pretty cool, I think. It's like another layer of micro strategy that you can leverage in that particular position. I'm not sure how much of this stuff is intentional, because a lot of the times you just evolve this sort of thing over time, and you don't really see these level of like very, very particular things, right? In terms of like the angles, like that stuff comes up over time. Sometimes it is deliberately like pushed in that direction, but interesting to note all of those different things that make this map what it is. And yeah, ultimately I think this map just has a lot going for it. Not really a whole lot holding it back either. The question of whether or not it's T or CT sided, I think is still open actually, because no matter what the initial Face It games might say, or the like anecdotes from people who have played this regardless of what level of skill they are at some point adaptation has to come into play. Like people thought Nuke was like forever CT sided, and for a while it was. And some of those changes that were meant to make it better for the Ts ended up making it sometimes better for the CTs or whatever the case may be, down the years, obviously. But more recently, people have adapted and figured out ways to actually get a lot of T rounds, and now it's a... I don't know if it's an even split, but it's not nearly as bad as it was before. And what I mean by that is you just don't know until you see like top teams battle it out on some of these maps. And that's something that I would really love to see for this particular map. I just feel like it only makes sense. It's got a lot of work put into it. Attention to detail is nice, very readable and clean. Bit of clutter over on the T side, but ultimately not anything that you have to worry about. Haven't really seen that many custom player models on this, so I don't know how that takes it into account. Obviously, this map was made before those changes even came in by Valve anyway, so wouldn't be surprised if some color correction was needed in a few areas for very specific reasons. But there's a lot going for this map. I urge you to check it out and play it with your friends. I also hope that I see this in a major or something sometime soon. That would be really epic. Obviously, we may not ever see a major again. It may just be Corona Town forever. But assuming that's not the case, and assuming we end up getting to see this added in competitive play at some point, I mean, that would just make me a very happy man. So, put your thoughts about this map in the comment section below. Follow the mappers on Twitter. It's BubkeZ and Oliver. They're down there in the description. Check out the map, link in the description, and check out whatever else is in the description. I talked about that I would leave some other link in the description. Oh yeah, the interview with Oliver. Check that out too. He's a pretty cool guy. Talks about the art process and the process of working with BubkeZ and all of the things that made this map what it is, as well as a little bit more about his other maps. So definitely worth your time, worth a watch, worth a click, and worth a smooch. Mwah.